Hi guys, it's Garth Harris, Vice President of Product Innovation here at Cake, and welcome to training number 3, a part of our starter series for lead distribution. Let's jump into a quick review of where we've come from so we can also talk about our agenda moving forward. So we started with training number 1, which was covering just the fundamentals, our keywords, and just talking about how lead distribution works in general and the workflow. We then went into training number 2, which was all about lead collection and building out your vertical so you can actually generate that posting doc that you give to an affiliate partner or to your team internally so that you can capture leads inside of Cake. So now that we have a good fundamental understanding of how Cake works, how to navigate Cake, and how to get leads into the platform, training number 3 is going to be primarily focused on how to route your leads to your buyers. So we're going to be talking about the actual distribution and posting of the leads. We'll be talking about how to manage your queues, your schedules, and how to actually monetize your leads as well. And then our last training will be focused on reporting and accounting. Now let's get into a bit of an agenda. So again, this is another setup and implementation. So specifically we'll be talking about your buyers and your buyer contracts. We'll be talking about how to create a buyer. We'll be talking about buyer budgets, so being able to apply credit at the buyer level. And then we'll talk about what a buyer contract is. So this is a one-to-many relationship with your buyers. So one buyer can have multiple contracts because they may be purchasing different types of leads from you. So you could have a mortgage lead being sold and then a refi lead, so a new mortgage versus a refi. Those might be two different buyer contracts for the same buyer. So we'll get into that and how to set those up as part of this training as well. We'll be going, like I said, going into the scheduler. So this is going to be a daily schedule that gets built every single day at midnight within your time zone that resets things like daily caps, adjusts for price adjustments, and if there's any kind of changes to the actual posting docs themselves. And then we'll get into the lead queues. So the lead queues is going to be the scrub queue, the review queue, and the actual queue itself. So we'll talk about how you can manage those independently of each other. And then lastly, we will end on how to process a lead return. So there's a few different options for you in regards to how you can allow your buyers to return leads to you if that's part of your workflow. So let's go ahead and jump in. We'll start with the introduction on what a buyer is and how to create a buyer. All right, we're going to begin this training by going through the basics of what it takes to build a buyer and go over some of the settings about the buyer itself as well. So what is a buyer inside of Cake? A buyer is the purchaser of lead data from a lead generation campaign. So whether they're a lender, a lawyer, financial advisor, etc., that is a buyer. So they are the ones that you are actually delivering the lead data to. So we're going to be talking about how to set up buyers. We're going to be talking about the buyer portal settings. Cake offers a login portal for the buyers in case you are selling leads to a buyer that doesn't have a CRM and does not prefer to receive their leads through an email. You have the ability to give your buyers access to the buyer portal so that they can download their leads and they can also initiate returns from there as well. We'll be talking about how to set up buyer credit or prepaid. So there's a couple different ways that you can manage your money with your buyers within Cake. So we'll be going over both of those. There is a buyer level lead cap. So there are multiple areas in which you can set caps inside of Cake. Buyers are one of those levels. So you can say this buyer can only purchase, so many leads per day or so many leads per month. So that is one feature that we'll be going over that we feel is very pertinent to the setup of buyers. And then lastly, we'll be talking about how to create buyer contacts, and we'll actually log into the buyer portal so we can show you exactly what that looks like and how to navigate that. All right, let's jump into Cake for a quick demo on how to add a buyer. All right, so we're going to show you how to add a buyer, and we're also going to show you some settings that apply to the buyers. And then we'll go through a few of the actions that you can take on the buyer related to credit and prepaid amounts, etc. Because understanding how money works on buyers is actually going to be quite important for you as you set up your buyers and your buyer contracts down the road for selling the leads. So before we actually add a buyer, I just want to show you exactly where you can find your existing buyers, much like your affiliates and your advertisers and offers, etc. So your buyers are going to exist within the lead gen main tab of the system underneath the buyers sub tab. So you can see that we already have a handful of buyers in here. We'll go ahead and add a new buyer. You can use this grid by clicking on the add buyer button here, or like always, we can use our action menu to find buyers down below here, and then clicking on this plus icon to launch the add a new buyer wizard. Now, adding a new buyer is very simple. It's very much similar to adding a new affiliate where it just requires a name. You can put in the credentials there if you'd want to send your buyer login access immediately. Otherwise, you can just put in the name there and then add contacts to your buyer down the road. So we'll go ahead and put new buyer 2 since we already have a buyer in there called new buyer. And then we'll go ahead and bypass all of these fields here and click next and finish. And here we can see that we have the buyer card created. Now, before we go too far into the buyer itself, I do want to give you a quick overview of the buyer settings that exist within setup. So let's go ahead and go there now. So within setup, underneath our settings subtab, we then have our buyer portal settings. Now there's just a handful of settings that you can change or modify for your buyers. And one of those is actually just a Twitter handle that you can put in there in case you want to have certain communication to your buyers as well. So we'll just focus on the top 3 here. So if you want to show the remaining credit that your buyers have when logging into the buyer portal, you can go ahead and tick that first box. Now we also have an integration with authorized.net that becomes required if you want to do certain things in regards to money with your buyers. So if you want to hide that wizard altogether, go ahead and tick that box as well if you're not using authorized.net. Now you may be using some other third-party payment processor outside of Cake, which is totally fine. However, we do have a native integration with authorized.net, which allows you to then show that wizard directly in the portal. Now, when your buyers are returning leads, assuming that's a part of your workflow, so you've sold a lead to a buyer and the buyer has returned that lead to you, you then have the opportunity to then accept that return, which means you can kick off some workflow downstream of how you handle money to the affiliates or leads to the affiliates, or you could reject that return. So essentially your buyer is saying, I don't want this lead. And you look at the lead and you're like, this lead was contacted, we spoke to the person, this was a legitimate lead, there's no reason why you should be returning this lead to me, I'm going to reject that return. So all of that said, you can choose to hide your reject reasons from the buyer portal in case you don't want your buyers to see that. So there are a few options here for what you can and can't show to the buyers themselves. So let's go ahead and pop back over to our buyer that we just created and go through first and foremost our money. And I think this is probably the most important conversation to have regarding your buyers, because understanding how money works is just, there's a couple options here. And so we just want to make sure that we're clear on both. So you can see that there's 2 different paths that we have in regards to money. We have this concept of credit, and then we also have this concept of prepaid amount. So we'll go ahead and start off with credit. Now, credit off to the right-hand side here, we see credit limit option, and it says custom, which means that the system is assuming that we want to apply some level of credit to our buyer. And here's how we define credit. Credit is essentially the same thing as giving your buyers a credit card. So they spend your money, then they have to pay you back at the end of the billing cycle for whatever they've spent. So essentially, they get to use your credit to buy leads from you. And if you want to have an open-ended kind of like, hey, we're just going to give you an unlimited number of credit, there is no limit, you can actually switch this credit limit option to unlimited and then click save. And you'll notice that this now kind of goes away. And essentially what you're saying is they're on credit, but I'm just going to let them go free. They can buy as many leads as they want. I will then invoice them for what they've paid at the end of the month. And so I don't want to cap their buying process. However, if you do want to give them some level of credit, so like a credit card, for example, what I can do here is say, okay, well, you get $1,000 per month since the billing cycle is on a monthly basis here. Click Save, and you'll now notice that our credit remaining says 1,000. So as this buyer is purchasing leads throughout the month, let's say that each lead was $10, just to keep it simple. You'll see that credit remaining number go down by $10 with every lead that is sold. So it'll go down to 990, 980, etc. And then over the course of the month, it'll go down. Now, the question is, if the buyer wants to get another $1,000 at the beginning of next month, you're going to have to true them up. So you're going to have to basically understand what the difference is between the original 1,000 and how much they have left over remaining, and then add manual credit to kind of true them up. So quick example, simple example, let's say they spent $500 of their 1,000 credit in the course of a single month, and they want to start the next month, you've agreed, with the same $1,000. So what you would do is you would click Add Manual Credit, put the amount as 500 to give them an additional $500 back into their credit. You can put in an invoice number, a verification code, some notes, etc. Click Next, review that, and then hit Finish. And then this number here will bounce back up to 1,000, understanding that Cake does not auto-refresh their budget on whatever billing cycle they have. That's not the assumption that we have baked into our logic. So you would have to essentially true up this buyer for their next credit. Now, there's a separate workflow that you can also take. And you can actually play these workflows in tandem together, which some of our clients do as well. There's the prepaid workflow, which means that instead of giving them a credit limit, you would actually leave that to 0. So I can put this to 0 here. And then I can give them a prepaid amount. Now, the function of adding prepaid to your buyer, so they've given you money in advance at the beginning of the month, and now they're just going to spend their prepaid money. The way you would do that is you would click on Add Manual Credit, put in that value, put in the same details, click Next and Finish, and now your buyer has a prepaid amount of $500, which you'd be able to use. So let's go ahead and refresh this buyer, because I don't believe that's refreshing here. So let's refresh the grid and then open up this buyer card again. And now you can see that we have the $500 prepaid. Now, some of our clients say, well, if the $500 runs out, I do want to give my buyer a bit of runway to spend some more money on credit, in which case you can actually kind of have a little bit of a floater account for them to say, well, you can have an additional $250, there we go, in credit. And so essentially what Cake will do is we will use the prepaid amount first, and then we'll start to go into the credit, and then you can invoice them for whatever they've spent on credit. So again, those are two completely separate workflows, and you can kind of choose one or the other or both to manage your buyers and how that money impacts their buying ability over the course of the billing period. And if you look off to the right-hand side here on the grid, you'll see we show these summaries for you. So we see we have the $500 prepaid, and then we have the $250 credit. So that is buyer credit and prepaid amount. So let's go ahead. And one thing else to mention before we move on, if you are using the authorized.net integration, that's where this add credit from card functionality works out. So you clearly, if you're not using authorized.net and you haven't put in your credentials into Cake and connected your accounts, then this workflow will be meaningless, because it's essentially going to ask you for credit card information that will be stored on authorized.net. And then you can choose to kind of add those credentials again on the next billing period and continue to kind of go down that same workflow. But this wizard will just simply error out if you are not connected to authorized.net. So that is buyer credit and prepaid. So let's go ahead and move on. The next thing we want to cover is buyer level lead cap. So you can essentially manage caps at multiple levels within the platform. You can manage caps on the inbound, which we discussed earlier with offer level caps. But you can also manage how many leads your buyer purchases regardless of money. So obviously the money will run out at some point, in which case they will stop buying leads because they will have no more money. However, you could manage this to say, hey, well, even though they have essentially a budget of $750, you may want to then go to the caps tab and say, well, they can only buy 5 leads per day, regardless of their cap. So I want to make sure that I'm giving them a consistent amount of leads on a daily basis. And this is usually determined by the buyer that's saying, hey, look, I can only handle so many leads per day, regardless of how much I can spend. So that's how you can manage your caps, which again is a different functionality than the money side of the fence. All right, so the last thing we want to kind of cover here is how to add the contacts and then logging into the buyer portal. Now, as you saw from our buyer portal settings, the buyer portal itself is actually quite a minimalistic portal. It's really there simply for the buyer to review and download the leads and then potentially invoke a returns process as well. So let's go ahead and show you how to add contacts first. So on the buyer card, we have the contacts tab, and we'll go ahead and add a contact, in which case you'll put in the email address, the contact type, which is just allowing you to categorize your contacts, first name, last name, and then as soon as you click next and finish, you can choose for Cake to deliver those credentials to the buyer, in which case they will go through the process of creating their password, etc., and getting in. So you can create as many contacts for this buyer as you'd like, and they can all have access to the buyer portal if you wish. And so we don't need to create one. We can do what's called a virtual login to our buyer portal. So go ahead and click on this login button and just walk you through a few of the features. So as you can see here, we did not hide the authorized.net wizard using our buyer portal settings, which is why this actions menu is here, which allows us to pay by card. So if you are using authorized.net though, it's a great resource. It allows buyers to essentially add more money to their account on their own without having to go through you. So you can just allow them to self-service in that way. We do have a couple of simple reports for them to see how many leads they're purchasing across different verticals and contracts, etc. And then ultimately the leads dashboard where the buyer can actually see some leads and they can actually invoke, like I said, those returns, assuming we have returns enabled for those leads. And you can customize that per program that they're buying leads from. So per buyer contract, etc. So that is the overview of our buyers and how to add buyers. And next we will go into an introduction of buyer contracts. All right, we're now going to introduce you to buyer contracts and some items that go along with the contracts. So what is a buyer contract in Cake? It is the relationship between a buyer and the vertical they're purchasing leads from. So one buyer can have multiple buyer contracts. There's a couple reasons why one buyer might have multiple buyer contracts. So the first reason is your buyer is purchasing leads from you from across multiple verticals. So you may have an insurance vertical, you may have an education vertical, and you may have a mortgage vertical, and you may be selling leads across all 3 verticals to one buyer. This means that your buyer would have one buyer contract per vertical. Now, another reason why one buyer might have multiple buyer contracts is because you may have different price points that you're selling leads to across the same vertical. So you have one buyer, one vertical. However, they may be buying leads from you at a higher price because the credit score is a premium credit score or tier 1 credit score. And they may be paying less money for tier 2 or tier 3 credit scores. So there's different reasons why you may have different contracts. but essentially it's a one-to-many relationship inside of Cake. So we'll go through how to create a buyer contract. We will review the delivery schedule. So this is essentially what days of the week and at what times you are selling leads to your buyer. We'll also go through the routing rules. So essentially, you can create specific scenarios where leads from maybe one affiliate or leads from one offer should or should not go to your particular buyer. So routing allows you to have very close control over the source of the leads and which buyers are purchasing them. We'll then go through lead filters. So if you remember from setting up our vertical, we created our first filter, which was around credit score. We even applied that filter at the vertical level as a paid filter. Now, lead filters on the buyer contract are going to allow us to control what types of leads your buyer is purchasing. So we can use credit score as an example again, and we'll show you how to apply that at the buyer contract level and how to create those values so that you are choosing which leads go to your buyer contracts. And we'll go through some common examples as well to help you out. We'll go through the delivery method. So when leads are ready to sell to your buyer, there are different ways in which you can deliver those leads to your buyer. So we have email, you can do a straight post. There's different methods of posting. There's SOAP, XML, GET, etc. And we even have ping. So you can ping your buyer first for a multiple variety of reasons. And then after the ping comes back successfully, you can choose to then post your lead to your buyer, maybe with a dynamic price that you've just received or some kind of value that you need to append, etc. So Cake does support that ping post workflow. And then ultimately we'll show you how to send a test lead manually through the buyer contract so that you can ensure that your posting docs that you got from your buyer were set up correctly. So let's go ahead and dive into Cake again, and we'll walk you through how to create a buyer contract and some of those things we just discussed. All right, we are back at the buyer that we just created, and now we are going to create our first buyer contract. Now from the buyer card directly, you'll see that we have a tab called Contracts. So go ahead and click on that. And you'll notice that we do not have any contracts just yet. So we'll go ahead and click on Add Contract. And then choose our contract name. Now, we can choose to just say Finance Contract or give it a name, but usually you're going to want to have a very particular name so that when you're going through your schedule and your list of buyer contracts, you'll know how to recognize this right away. So we'll just say Finance Contract. And then you'll see that we have to assign it to a vertical. So we did have Finance 2 as the vertical we created earlier in this training. That also happens to have that filter attached to it. Now the next box here is called Max Post Errors. Essentially what this feature of the system allows you to do is if you are selling leads to your buyer and the buyer is using a CRM and has responses coming back to the system. So you sell a lead to the buyer and they get a success. You sell another lead, you get a success. Well, what happens if you sell a lead to your buyer and you get an error response? That error could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because their server is down. It could be because they weren't accepting your leads for one reason or another. So essentially, Cake is saying, well, what happens if we get 10 consecutive errors in a row? Well, we will actually turn off that buyer contract and not try to sell any more leads to them because, again, they may have an outage on their server that you don't know about. Cake is attempting to sell leads to this buyer and that server is down. And so we're just going to go ahead and at the 10th error, we're going ahead and turn off that buyer contract, and then Cake will just try to sell your leads to your other buyers. Now, this is a text field because you can modify this. You can say, well, if there's 3 errors in a row, turn it off. Now, we're only ever going to look back at the last 10, which means if you never want Cake to turn off this buyer contract because of any errors that are going on, because you may be the
you may be in a vertical that actually has quite a bit of errors that occur. Maybe there's a lot of duplicates for one reason or another. If you don't want to turn off the buyer contract, simply change this to 11, and now Cake will say, well, of the last 10, I needed to have 11 in a row, which can never happen, obviously. So that's our way of saying do not turn off the buyer contract in a max post error situation. So we'll just go ahead and keep this 10, which is our default. Click next and finish, and our buyer contract card will open up right away for us. Now, one thing that we did not discuss in the PowerPoint as a bullet point of talking items was money on the buyer contract. Now, we discussed money, whether a credit or a prepaid option on the buyer, and you now have control of that money at the contract level. So you may have a buyer that can spend $1,000 a month, but that buyer may be purchasing leads across two verticals, in which case you'd have two buyer contracts. And you may want each buyer contract to have equal credit. So essentially 500 and 500. And so the way that we can do that, and in our case actually we have a credit limit of 250 and a balance of 500. So we'll go ahead and say this buyer contract can have $250 of the prepayment. So we'll go ahead and select change credit for contract, add 250, click next and finish. And now we have $250 assigned to this buyer contract. Now, if you ever wanted to say, well, that was a mistake, I shouldn't have applied the credit, then what we can do is we can go back to change credit for contract and just leave this blank. By doing so, it's the system's way of actually saying, no, let's actually allow this contract to have unlimited resources of the buyer. So we'll go ahead and click next and finish. And now you can see that we've gone back to unlimited. All right, so the first thing we want to show you is the delivery schedule. So the delivery schedule is the days and the times of days that this buyer can purchase leads. So if you have a buyer, and this is based on the time zone that you set up when you first became a client. So your onboarding manager asked you for your time zone. We set that up in your system. So if you're in Pacific Standard, just know that this schedule is going to reflect that as well. So if you have a buyer who will buy leads from you 24/7, then we try to make it easy for you by clicking this button here, 24/7, and then from there you're going to fill out this wizard that's going to ask you, well, how many leads per day can they purchase from you? At what price point will these leads be? And then we'll ask you a series of questions around the type of buyer it is. So that's one method, and we'll get back to that in just a second. The second method is you may be selling leads to somebody who wants to be in their office. They only want to be at their desk ready for those leads because the timeliness of those leads matter. So in that case, you would select Monday, start time of, let's call it 9 a.m. Your buyer leaves the office at 5 p.m. They want to buy 20 leads from you per day, and the price point is $10 per lead. And now we'll get back to that type that I saw in the 24/7 dropdown. So this type is going to determine whether or not your buyer is buying leads from you exclusively, whether they're part of a broader multi-sell, or whether they can actually be a bit of both, which is what hybrid is. So if you select exclusive, this means that this buyer will only ever buy leads from you where nobody else can buy the leads as well. So when you sell this buyer a lead on this contract, it is going to be an exclusive sale. You cannot sell that lead more than once. If you select multi-sell, that means that this buyer contract can only purchase leads from you if you happen to be selling the same exact lead to another buyer. So the multi-sell has to work. If this buyer is the only available buyer at the time of purchase, and there's no other buyers available, and this is set to multi-sell, Cake will not sell the lead to this buyer. because what we're saying here is that they have to be part of a multi-cell, because usually multi-cell determines the cost. If it was a hybrid situation, in that case, Cake will say, look, we're going to try to be a part of a multi-cell, but if the multi-cell situation doesn't present itself, then we will go ahead and sell that lead exclusively to this buyer contract, even though we tried to do a multi-cell. Okay? Now, we're going to go ahead and skip over these other two because there's these tick boxes because they're not a part of our fundamentals, but they can be found in our knowledge base, and actually just go straight to this no return. When you sell this lead to this buyer, you can choose whether or not you want to allow your buyer to return the leads to you or not. So that is one option that you have here. So if you select no return, that means the buyer cannot return the leads to you. It's a final sale situation. Otherwise, if you don't tick this box, then the buyers can log into the buyer portal and they can go ahead and mark leads as returned based on your return policy that you've created. So this is the scheduler. Cake builds the schedule every night at midnight. And so I'll go ahead and click update. And then you would go ahead and click add, and then add Tuesday, and then go Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, knowing that every day could be different. And you can actually have several line items for the same day, assuming that the times don't overlap. All right, so that is the schedule. Moving on to the routing rules. So routing rules allows you to define which traffic sources can sell to this buyer contract. Now, if you want any leads across this vertical to come into this buyer, then by all means, do not touch the routing rules. However, you may have leads coming in from one affiliate that affiliate can only sell leads to this buyer, and consequently, this buyer can only buy leads from that affiliate. So that's a one-to-one relationship, in which case you would click add, choose the affiliate, choose the type of one-to-one allow, and now we have this exclusive relationship between traffic source and buyer. And you can kind of mess with these routing rules all you want to create elaborate schemes of where the leads can funnel from and where they can go to. So that is routing rules. So the next thing I want to show you is filters. So filters are going to determine what leads can sell to this buyer from this particular vertical. So we chose the Finance 2 vertical, and as of right now, the leads are coming in, and there's no routing rules, no filters, therefore every lead can sell to this buyer. However, this buyer contract may only want to buy leads from maybe a particular state, or only from leads where the credit score is 700 or above. Otherwise, they don't want to buy the leads. So in that case, we would click add, select our filter of contain state, and then we can say California, for example. Now, if you want to get into multiple values, then you would use our pipe separator here, and we would actually say and Oregon, for example. And so I can update that, and now I have this contains value. I can also choose the credit score, right? So credit score greater than or equal to, that was the filter I built previously, and we'll say 750. Go ahead and click update. And now I have two filters, which means that Cake will only sell leads to this buyer contract when these are both true. So it's an and statement, it's not an or statement. And then you can remove filters if you'd like as well. All right, the next thing I want to show you is the delivery method. So the delivery method is how leads get to your buyers. So on the simplest of methods, we have email. So we have emails to send leads to. So I would put in the buyer's email address, click add, type that in, hit finish, and you're done. So Cake, when the lead sells, we will just deliver the lead to your buyer's email. Now, in a more sophisticated situation, your buyer is using a CRM or some type of software. Maybe they're using Cake, and you need to be able to post your lead to the buyer using more of a posting document. So much like how we have posting documents on the vertical level, so just to remind you, if I go home here, I can actually open up my vertical card here using this little breadcrumb here, and then I can open up my posting doc. Now, you are going to receive potentially a similar posting doc from your buyer. Now, it may not look exactly like this unless they're using Cake, but the workflow should be similar. So you should have a URL that you're posting to, and you're going to have fields that you need to map things to. So let's just pretend that the buyer that you're selling leads to is using Cake, and it happens to be this particular affiliate that we're using here. We're just going to pretend that this is our buyer. So here I have my posting instructions. You may submit this using either a get or a post, but post is preferred. Okay, so we go back into Cake, and we're going to close out this card and go back to our delivery method. And now we have our post URL. So it's going to walk us through the workflow here. So if there requires some kind of username or password to actually get into this post URL, then great. With Cake, we wouldn't put it here. We'd actually put it here in the parameters for the CKM key and the campaign ID. So going back to my posting doc, I'm going to copy this URL, put it in here, click Save, and as soon as I click Save there, you'll notice that I can now start mapping values from the leads that I'm receiving to the buyer that I'm posting to. So I'll just do a quick example. So let's say we're mapping first name. So first name is coming in on our leads, and our buyer wants us to send leads to them with first name included. The question is, well, how does your buyer accept first name? So we'll go ahead and click Add. The parameter is going to be how the buyer receives first name. So let's, again, pretending that this came from our buyer, we'll go back to our posting doc, find first name. So first name is right here. And we can see here that first name, they receive it as first_name, in which case we'll copy that, pop it into our parameter field, and then we will map it to first name on our vertical. So what we've done here is essentially we've mapped first name from Cake leads, and we're going to be posting the lead to our buyer with first_name. So that is an example of how we're going to go ahead and map all of our leads. Now, the default behavior here is that we are sending these leads as a post. If we wanted to send it as a get, because that is the buyer's requirement, we would actually want to check this box here, click update, and now we're basically saying Cake is going to send it as a get as opposed to a post. Now the alternative workflow from email, get, and post is actually going to be some kind of JSON or XML response, and so you would copy and paste all of the code there, and then you would go through all of the fields and you would replace them with the Cake fields so that, hey, we're sending the leads dynamically that way. So that is how you would go through that experience. Now, if we're sending leads to a buyer, such as a Cake system, right? When the lead gets posted to the buyer's server or their system should respond with some kind of response. And that response, because it's just computers talking to each other, we need to know what that response is. Is that response a, hey, we got a success, so we know that the lead got to the buyer successfully? Or was there some kind of error? Was there a duplicate? And so we can actually go back to the Cake posting doc and we can see, okay, well, what are some of the responses that we can expect to receive on certain situations? So let's just go to the responses section here. It says, the return format is XML. A successful post will return a result code of 0 and success as the message. So we can see here that we have the result, the code, and we even have a message right here with a lead ID. So we now know that if I see code with a 0, that means it was a success. So if I go into here and I go to responses and I click add, I now know that if I see this value right here in the response from my buyer, which again, we're choosing cake as our example, I should interpret that as a success. Okay, so go ahead and click update, and now I know that anytime it's basically looking for a contains, right? So it's just looking for the string of data coming back from the response, because the response is going to come back to cake as an XML response, and cake is going to scan that response. And if anywhere we see code and then the bracket 0, and then we have this code here again to close out the node, we will interpret that as a success. So that's how cake will know how to post the lead and how we know it arrived successfully to the buyers. Now, every system is going to be different. This is just an example. So if you have any questions or need any help, please contact our support team, or you can even go to getcake.com/services and fill out the form there, and our professional services team can actually do these for you, because we have so much experience doing them that we can very quickly add your buyer's posting docs into cake, and we just know how to navigate the system, so it'll help you get up there a bit quicker. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is how to send a test lead. So from here, we can say send test post, and we can put in the lead ID, we can put in all these values in case the buyer wants them, and now we have all of the fields available to us from the vertical. Now if I scroll down a bit more, you'll notice that we even have our custom field that we created called credit score. So I can put in all these values, click next and finish, and cake will actually attempt to send a test lead to your buyer to get the response, just to make sure that we understand that we are receiving that response correctly. So that is how you build a buyer contract. That is how you develop the delivery method and the schedule. So the next thing we're going to do is actually go through how to manage the daily buyer schedule. So we're going to go into the review queue, the scrub queue, and the queue with the actual schedule in mind as well, so that we can talk you through, okay, well, once you have buyers purchasing leads on a day-to-day basis, what can I manage? All right, now that we've built out a buyer contract, we now have all the building blocks for actually delivering the leads to our buyers. So the next thing we want to introduce to you is kind of a hybrid between a report and a tool, and it's the daily schedule. Now the schedule is going to be a tool that gets built every day at midnight, because on your contracts, as we just saw, you can have buyers that purchase leads from you at different days of the week and at different times of the day. So we rebuild this schedule on a daily basis just to make sure that we have all the most accurate information available. So just to kind of read that definition real quick for you, the daily buyer schedule allows you to quickly see your active buyer contracts and to manage your lead delivery for the day. So again, it is a tool for you to be able to see who's active, who's buying leads, and there's a few columns in this grid that we'll go over as well. So we'll talk you through how to find how much your buyer contracts are purchasing leads for as a quick reference guide, when they're buying leads, so the open and closed delivery hours. You can see your buyer's balance, so how much money they have in total versus how much money they've spent. We'll also talk about being able to see just quickly at a high level how many leads your buyer has purchased from you. And this is going to be a color-coded number, so that you can see, okay, this buyer is actually getting closer to their cap for the day. So I now know to either give them a call or just to be aware of that. We'll go over the post error column, which was a tool that we described when we built our first buyer contract. And then I'll also introduce a new concept for you called priority, which we'll discuss when we actually get to the buyer contract, or the schedule. So let's go ahead and get back into the system, and I'll introduce you to the schedule. The buyer schedule can be located in the lead gen main tab and then in the schedule sub tab. So here we have a few examples of some buyers and their buyer contracts that we're going to go through kind of column by column. So first, the one thing I want to show you is this concept of one-to-many. So we have this idea that one buyer can actually have multiple buyer contracts, maybe depending on the vertical that they're buying from or based on the filters and price points that they're purchasing leads from as well. So here you can see that the buyer known as finance lead buyer actually has a couple of contracts in here because, again, it may be differentiated by vertical or by the filters themselves. So I'm just going to go left to right here, starting with the actual drop down. So this is going to encompass all of your buyer contracts and their buyers across all verticals. But if we want to just say, hey, just show me my buyers and their subsequent contracts based on the vertical we just built, I can select Finance 2, and then it just helps me narrow down the schedule for the day. Otherwise, I can just say all verticals and everything will pop up here. So we do have our buyer contract name, and these, anytime you see the blue hyperlinks here, we can open up the card and we can modify that object directly from here. So we have the name of the buyer contract, the buyer that it's related to. We can see here that for today, the price for these leads are at $10. We also have our schedule. So we have, well, this buyer will only buy leads from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. based on the local time zone of my server that I created Cake on. So in my case, Pacific Standard Time, so I'd be seeing 9 to 5. This buyer contract, or these two buyer contracts rather, have a 24/7 schedule, so less relevant. We can also see this concept of negative money, in which case these buyers had a credit limit of $1,000, and so far they've spent $10 of that $1,000. So we can kind of see that money chiseling away. Whereas this buyer, we had a kind of this hybrid setup of prepayment and credit. So we can see the prepayment amount and then also the credit amount, and we'll see those numbers kind of dwindle down as we sell leads. Now, sold simply refers to how many leads for the day that we've sold to this buyer contract, in which case we have 0, but you can see that we have caps over off to the right-hand side here. So as we're selling leads, it'll start off on green, and then the field will turn to yellow as we get kind of in the middle ground, and then you'll see that it actually turns to red once we hit our cap. So the color coordination as you build your book of buyers and as you're selling leads throughout the day becomes a very useful tool to be able to glance and be like, okay, where are all my buyers at and their contracts? And you can sort by these columns as well, which makes it very easy. Now, the errors column refers to the errors that your buyers respond to you as you attempt to sell them leads. So again, if you have a buyer contract set up to automatically turn off after 10 subsequent errors, then you would be able to see, okay, well, this buyer contract is getting closer to that number. It's also a hyperlink, so you can actually open up to see what those errors are so that you know exactly what's going on with your buyer and you can troubleshoot from there. We're going to bypass a couple of these columns because they're not necessarily in our fundamentals. They're a bit more on the advanced side of the fence, and just skip straight over to this on column. Now, as you can see, we built this buyer contract today. And the buyer contract schedule rebuilds the schedule every morning at midnight. But we built this buyer contract in the middle of the day. So what is the default behavior of the schedule? It will add the row to the schedule, but it won't turn it on until tomorrow at the next available date. Now, if you want to build a buyer contract today and get that buyer buying leads from you today, then what you do is actually double click on this row and tick the on box. And now you'll see that, hey, this schedule is now ready to go. So it doesn't have to wait until the next morning at midnight to add this schedule and make it active. You can actually make it active right away. We can also see our type, and then we can also see priority. Now, priority is a new concept. The default behavior of Cake is that Cake is always trying to sell leads to your buyers based on price. So the price priority. You can override that, though, by actually turning on this concept called priority. And that basically tells Cake, hey, I want you to sell the next available lead to the buyer that has the highest priority. And then after all the priority buyers have been exhausted, then move into a bidding war with all the default price. So that is how priority works. The highest priority is actually 0, and then it just goes down from there. So the next highest priority would be 1, the priority after that would be 2. Now this is not a training on priority, so we do have knowledge-based documentation about priority, but that is a concept that we want to introduce to you. All right, we're going to transition into discussing our queues. Now there's 3 queues if you remember from earlier. We have our scrub queue, our review queue, and the queue. So let's go into a few definitions. So the lead queues are lead stores that help you manage the routing of valid and invalid leads that have been posted into Cake. There are 3 types of lead queues in Cake. So the first queue is essentially where Cake is actively trying to sell your leads. This only works in hosted offers. So let me just read the definition real quick. Leads in the queue have passed vertical and offer level validation and are actively trying to sell to buyers. This queue is typically used by the hosted offer type since leads do not have to sell in real time. So again, this is our main routing engine that's looking for buyers that are available. It's prioritizing them based on the price or based on priority, which was a feature we just introduced. So this is an active engine that's happening at all times. On the other hand, we have the review queue. So leads in the review queue have not passed validation and they need additional review before they can sell to a buyer. From the review queue, you have the option to send a lead to the queue or to the scrub queue. So essentially, the review queue is exactly how it sounds. You've intentionally put a lead there, or the lead did not pass validation, and therefore you've created a rule that forces those leads to go into the review queue. So from there, you can open up your lead, and then you can call your lead, you can email the lead outside of Cake, and you can just validate or update the information and then make a decision. Either push it to the queue, or you can say, hey, this lead is not qualified, and therefore it goes into the scrub queue. Which leads us to our third and final queue, the scrub queue. Leads in the scrub queue have not passed validation and are not capable of being sold to a buyer, or they were generated by a host and post offer type and were not sold in real time. So when we first built out our vertical, we chose to place validation on the first name field, if you remember. And one of the validators that I placed was first name had to be required. And so one of the validation options is, what do you want Cake to do if the lead does not pass the validation? Do you want to send this lead to the review queue, assuming that you are using a hosted offer? Or do you want to send the leads to the scrub queue? Because this lead can't sell. It has no opportunity to sell, so we're not even going to try to review it. The lead came without a first name, therefore we're going to send it directly to the scrub queue, and that's where leads will just sit, and they cannot actively be sold. Now, one thing that you will see and learn is that you can move leads between queues. So you can move a lead from the scrub queue to the other queues in case you need to resurrect the lead for one reason or another. So let's go ahead. We'll go into the system again, and we'll demonstrate how these queues work in real time. All right, so from the schedule, we're actually going to go to, first we're going to go to the scrub queue, and then we'll kind of work our way up to the queue. So if we click on the scrub queue here, we do see that there are a few leads that are here for one reason or another. And I'm going to walk you through a few ways in which you can interpret this data and to understand why are my leads in the scrub queue. Now again, the biggest reason why a lead is in the scrub queue is because it didn't pass some form of validation, and you actually told Cake during the vertical setup to send your leads here if there was a miss on the validation. Now, another reason why a lead might be here, another big reason, is that the lead maybe passed validation, but it didn't have any available buyers to actually sell it to. And those reasons could be because the buyer had specific filters set up that were not matched up, or the buyers were just not available during that time of day. So there could be a variety of reasons why the leads are ending up here. And so I posted a few examples of some basic leads that would, in theory, match to our finance buyer and therefore sell. And the reason why I did that is so we can walk you through just some easy tips and tricks on how to discover why leads maybe didn't sell or why they're here in the first place. So the first thing I want to point you to is actually this little sticky note off to the right-hand side. This is going to be the disposition. So this is your first tool. If I hover my cursor over the sticky note, it says no qualified buyers found, no qualified buyers found. So now I know that the lead made its way through, it passed the validation, but there just weren't any buyers available. And so the next thing I want to show you on how to troubleshoot is to actually open up the lead itself. So if I open up this first lead and I go to this buyers tab here, this is going to actually be a ledger of how Cake attempted to sell the lead. So the lead came in and then Cake did its thing. It looked across all of your buyers, all the buyer contracts, and it looked up everything from routing rules to filters to time of day, and it's going to tell us exactly why your lead did not sell. So the first thing we see here is contract filter unmatched. So the credit score, greater than or equal to. So if you remember, we actually put a filter of credit score on that particular buyer contract that said the lead had to be a credit score of 750 or greater. We also put a filter that the buyer contract had to be, or the leads had to be, within the state of California or Oregon. So if I go back to my lead information and I go through here, I see I didn't even have a state on this field. So that's an obvious reason why my lead did not sell to that buyer. Now my vertical specific information is going to introduce this credit score to me. I had a credit score on this lead of 710. So those are two obvious reasons why this lead could not sell to the buyer. And then because Cake could not find any available buyers in real time, we sent the lead to the scrub queue because it originated in a host and post offer where the leads had to sell right away. So let's go to the next lead. Again, no available buyers found, no qualified buyers. We open up the lead. Again, no state. Vertical information. Oh, I actually had above a 750 credit score. So if I go to the buyers tab, I see that we just missed on the state filter, but the credit score was working out just fine. So let's go to the third lead. Open up the lead card. I see I have a state this time, and I have a credit score that matches. So why didn't I actually sell the lead successfully to my buyer? The buyer was set up for it. So let's go to the buyers tab. Oh, it actually looked like it found the right buyer and the right buyer contract, but there was an unknown response from the buyer. So that response disposition, so if I open up this buyer contract and go to the delivery method, this response right here did not line up with what my buyer was expecting. So those are some reasons why your leads will go to the scrub queue, is because the lead has to successfully get to your buyer, and for the buyer to give us a success response for us to actually sell it correctly and go through the whole workflow. So those are a few simple examples of why your leads will end up in the scrub queue. Now you'll notice that we have the ability to tick some boxes here, or I can just tick all of them at the exact same time. And then from there, let's say that I want this lead that actually has a valid state and a good credit score. I want Cake to try to find a different buyer and just use the normal queue. So I can actually bypass the normal real-time logic of the system and manually move this lead to the queue or to the review queue. So you can actually manually move leads between these three queues here by just saying, hey, send to the queue. So we can go ahead and click that. Hit yes. That lead is now gone, and we'll go now to the next queue. So from here, we have the review queue. Again, the lead is here for one reason or another. We have the disposition, so we know why it was here, and now it's time to do the same thing. I can open up the lead, I can review the details, and then from there I can make a decision. I can either move this lead to be approved, which in theory just moves it to the queue, or I can reject the lead, which would actually move it to the scrub queue. So same logic, I can move it up a queue or down a queue. We also have this concept called cherry pick. Cherry pick is where you're basically saying, I approve this lead, but I'm going to actually tell the system which buyer to sell it to. So you know you owe a buyer of yours a particular type of lead, and you want to bypass Cake's logic of selling leads for price priority or based on our ranking priority. So you can actually cherry pick that lead, and that cherry pick will actually show up as a unique line item in your schedule. So we'll go back to the queue now, refresh this. So now we have that lead that I just moved from the scrub queue into the queue, and Cake is now going to attempt to sell that lead to a buyer, and it will tell us exactly how long it's been waiting for and the lead age. So it's basically saying, hey, look, we're just waiting. We haven't found a buyer yet, and this lead is this old. And after a while, that lead will expire and go to the queue, and that expiration age is something you set up at the vertical level. But yeah, we can choose to cherry pick this lead, or we can send it back to the review queue. So you can see how these leads are going in different, they have different opportunities for going up and down these paths. Now, one thing I did want to call out in that scrub queue lead, actually it's the lead I moved to the queue. So this lead here, we attempted to sell it, but we got an unknown response. And again, Cake could try to sell it again, got an unknown response. And we can see that error by going back into our schedule and refreshing this. And now we can see, hey, we have one error. And we can see that same exact lead. So I just wanted to kind of circle back to the schedule and show you that when Cake tries to sell a lead to a buyer and there's a bad response, you can see what that error is very quickly by clicking on that error. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about processing lead returns. So you've been able to successfully sell a lead to your buyer, but they've returned the lead for one reason or another. So as part of this process, we're going to go through a few settings that can help your workflow from start to finish. Our global settings offer a few settings in regards to how you manage the payment of the leads and the processing of the lead returns should you accept a return lead from your buyer. We also have buyer contract settings that allow you to overwrite your global settings. And then ultimately we have some tools on the campaign card that will allow you to ignore all those settings, not to disrupt the flow of specific affiliate that are sending you lead traffic. And then lastly, we'll talk through the returns queue so you know how to manage that as well. So yeah, let's get into it. We'll jump back into Cake and go through a live demonstration of how to process lead returns and go over some of those settings. Alrighty, we'll begin by showing you some of the global settings that we have available to you, and then we'll show you how you can control that on the buyer contract and ultimately some tools at the campaign level. And then from there, we'll actually go into the buyer portal and invoke a return and then show you what that looks like from your side. So first off, our global settings area, they can be found within the Setup main tab, Settings sub-tab, and then you'll click on Lead Gen Settings. So here you have some rejects and returns settings. We'll just go through them one at a time. So when a buyer returns a lead to you and you accept that return, so you're like, okay, yes, this lead, I accept the fact that you've returned it to me because the phone number was disconnected and we missed that somehow during our review process. So you process that return. And so now you want to say, okay, well, do you want to return that lead back to your affiliate as well? Because in some situations, such as a hosted offer, you're paying your affiliate for every lead that comes through, regardless if it sells. And if it does sell, regardless of the return. So this global setting actually allows you to then return that lead back to your affiliate, which could then kick off a couple other processes around removing money from the affiliate, or hey, we just won't pay you for the next one if you're doing that workflow. So there's a couple of things that you can do in that regard. So the next one is removing the affiliate payment. So assuming that you do return the lead to the affiliate, you can then say, well, I also want to remove the affiliate payment. So again, you've processed the return And instead of just returning it, what you're saying is I actually want to remove the payment altogether from the affiliate, from that original lead. So not from a future lead, from that original lead. The next one is going to be, do I want to return the payment? So returning the lead, the first option there, is not the same thing as returning the payment. So I want to make sure we communicate this clearly. So returning the lead actually allows you to mark the lead as returned to the affiliate, but it may not necessarily mean that you're returning the payment to the affiliate. So if you wanted to do those two in conjunction, you would actually check both of these, where you're actually marking it as returned for the affiliate's sake, and then actually removing the payment from the affiliate as well. So those are a few options that you have at your disposal, again, at a global level, which means it's going to impact all of your campaigns at the exact same time. So from here, we're going to transition back to our schedule and go over some of the options that we have at the buyer contract level and the campaign level. This is just where we left off last time. You can open up these cards from anywhere in the system. So on the buyer contract level, you have a couple of options here. You can say, hey, look, when I return a lead that got purchased by this particular buyer, so this is not a global setting, you want to go ahead and replace that return with another lead to that buyer. So the lead gets sold to the buyer, the lead is returned, and then you approve that return. So you're saying, hey, this lead, I approve. So now, how do we get that buyer basically trued up? So they paid money for that lead, but they've just marked it as returned. So now you essentially have to sell them another lead for free. So that's what replacing the return is. Now, what happens if you send them a replacement and they mark that as returned? And that's what this secondary option says, is that I'm not going to allow my buyer to mark my replacement lead as returned. So those are a couple of options that are available to you on the buyer contract level. Now, the last bit of settings that I want to show you is on the campaign card in the info tab. We have this ability for disabling returns. And this is kind of your wild card. It's going to overrule your global settings. So in that situation where the leads are coming in and you want your buyer to return them and kick off all these processes for returning payment, etc., you can essentially tick this box, click save, and now for this affiliate on the offer they're driving leads for, you are essentially saying that these leads cannot be marked as returned, and we can't return any of these leads, and therefore returning payment to the affiliate. So it is kind of like your trump card, it's your wild card. It's going to override any other settings that you have elsewhere. All right, so let me go ahead and exit out of these cards and show you our buyer portal and the process for returning the lead, and then show you our last queue, which is the returns queue. So here we can see, going back to our buyer contracts and the schedule for today, I had a few leads that errored out. They didn't manage to sell to the buyer for one reason or another, either because there was a missing filter or the response from the buyer was not mapped correctly. But we did manage to sell one lead today successfully. So let's go ahead and log in as the buyer. And now pretend we are the buyer. And we're going to review this lead, and we're going to choose to say that this lead should be returned. So I can go to my leads queue. I see the lead itself. I can actually open up the lead card from here and see all the details. So I can see email address, the state. I can see the credit score. But there's no phone number, there's no address, there's no other information that I need to call this lead a high quality lead. Now, obviously buyers will have other reasons, right? They'll call the lead and they'll find a disconnected phone number, or they'll call the lead and find out that the user was, not interested at all, and maybe somebody, a child accidentally filled out the lead, whatever the case may be, right? They're going to return the lead because it's bad quality. So let's go through that workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and click on return lead, choose my reject reason. So I'm rejecting this lead as the buyer because the user had no interest in the product. They're actually not looking for a mortgage, or they're not looking for an insurance product. So we'll go ahead and say not interested. Click finish. All right. So we've returned the lead successfully on March 15th. So let's go back into Cake. And as an admin, we now have this returns queue. So normally this, as I refresh and go between tabs, you'll see that this number will increment up. But if I go into the returns queue for today, I can see that we do have a lead that has been marked as returned, and I can see my returned reason. Not interested in the product. Okay, so maybe we go ahead and we call this user, we get them on the phone, and we determine, you're right, you're not interested in this product, and you filled out the wrong form, and therefore you're not valuable to me or to the buyer who bought this lead. So in this case, I can approve to replace, or I can approve for credit. Approving to replace is allowing us to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and give the buyer the next valuable lead for free. So we're not going to charge for the next lead. Or I can say, look, we'll give you a credit. So we'll give you your money back essentially. So we'll go ahead and do that workflow. Approve for credit. And now that lead has been approved. They've got their money back, and so now they can buy the next lead with their returned money. We'd like to bring some awareness as well to the opportunities you have to reach our support team, and also the services that are available to you in case you need a bit of help configuring your system or managing the platform in general. So from a technical support perspective, if you do need to reach us, probably the quickest way and the easiest way is just to send an email to support@getcake.com. That auto creates a ticket in our ticketing platform, and then from there, our support team will be corresponding with you over email. You may have a contract that includes phone support as well, in which case the phone number will be accessible inside of your platform with a PIN number. Otherwise, we are also going to be launching chat inside of Cake slowly but surely, so look out for that as well. Now, the best resource that we have for self-help is going to be our knowledge base. So there's a lot of content just like this in regards to videos, articles. We have a forum that I'll get to in just a second, but that will be support.getcake.com as the URL. And that's where you can access our knowledge base and all of the wonderful content there. Now, as I mentioned, if you do need some help configuring your system or managing Cake in any way, or even creating custom tools or custom reports or custom integrations with some of the platforms that you're using, Cake does have a professional services team as well that we would be more than happy to work with you on your projects that you have. Also, when you became a client, we added you to our distribution list for the customer newsletter, which is going to include a lot of great resources, including blog articles, recent product enhancements that we're making, other shout outs to other elements of our platform as well, our blog. So look out for the customer newsletter. There's a lot of great content that comes in there. And then lastly, we have our community forum, which is a place where you can read about recent platform enhancements. You can create new topics or threads, and the Cake community is there to help support you. To access technical support while you're within Cake, go ahead and click on your name in the bottom left, just right above setup there, and you'll be able to access our knowledge base or submitting a ticket, and that's probably the quickest and easiest way. Besides just sending an email to support@getcake.com. If you're already logged into Cake, then just go ahead and click on your name there and you have your access. All right, so coming up, we have our fourth and final training, and this is going to be centered around your reports. So we'll talk through how you can access lead gen and lead distribution specific reports and just learn how to use our reports in general. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please give our YouTube channel a thumbs up, subscribe. We have lots of content coming out. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining training number 3.